Okay, so my name is Earl Maicus, and I'm with Schluter Systems. I'm the Vice President of Commercial and Architectural Sales for Schluter Systems North America. Really thank you for joining us today. If you're joining us obviously in the room, thank you very much. If you're joining us online, definitely thank you for that as well. The presentation that we're going to be talking about today is about sound control, and really, so the title of the presentation is Sound Control, What You're Not Hearing. And we'll just I'll get into what this actually means. Primarily, it's directly related to the tile industry and to floors is what we're looking at. But we're going to take a look at sound in different aspects, whether it's floors or walls, with a strong focus on floors, of course. So basically, what we're going to talk about, hey, sound control. Why is it important? One of the things we're going to look at. We're also going to look at different types and rating systems of sound control. We'll also take a look at how the tile industry treated sound control in their handbooks, as well as the different techniques and applications for this as well. So, why is sound control important? Well, some of the main reasons, obviously, is that, first let's take a look at the types of projects, the type of places where sound control would be important. We're going to look at, buildings such as multifamily dwelling, residential applications. We're going to look at dormitories. It's also important there, right? Dormitories or hotels, big issue. Whenever you're dealing with sound, it has to do with, neighbors, right? Or, whether it's beside, above, or below. And that's what we're really going to be looking at in a lot of these applications. So why is it important, and who is it important to? If you think of residence or multifamily applications or housing applications, some of the more and more studies have been done, and they're constantly being done, and we're finding out that noise is definitely one of the most common quality of life complaints that we get. We want to make sure, noisy neighbors, it's the number one cause of irritation for multifamily living. It's a huge thing. And definitely if everybody is here at the show today, or if you're at a hotel, you hear the sound through and everything. So we definitely understand that. So in that aspect, though, why is it important? Well, definitely privacy is a big thing, right? Privacy is important, but there's actually more and more studies that are done about, quality of life and quality of sleep, and that if we think of at nighttime and getting a proper amount of sleep, this always gets tied back in, right? If you don't have enough sleep, or quality sleep, then you have less productivity, you can have more fatigue, and it definitely, inevitably comes into health and well-being, where, poor quality of sleep today affects you down the road. So it's very important on the residential side, the resident side. Now, in the same aspect, it's very, very important on the builder side. The builder side, if you're an architect or designer who's joining us today, or you're a distributor, or a consumer. These are things that are very important. On the builder side, we say on the slide here, it shows litigation costs. Well, it's much less expensive to address issues, at the initial stages of the project, or before we start production, than at the final stages, right? Remedies are much more expensive than initial costs. So we want to make sure that we address all of these issues and concerns, up front. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about. At the end of this whole presentation, one of the things we're going to learn is that, we want to manage the expectations of the project and of the consumer, so that they understand, what they're doing and what they're going to end up with a result. So one just rough example would be if you're dealing with a hotel or a school, and they say that the developer says that they want to have no sound transmission, but they're only going to have a 6-inch concrete slab with something, they're going to have sound, right? So we want to make sure that they understand up front that there is going to be some sound that's going to go through. And why is this important? Again, just the way that things happen so quickly now with, I like with this presentation, sometimes I like sound and sometimes I don't like sound, and it's just that easy, unfortunately. If you're, like flying in here, you stop through the airports, you stop into the restrooms, when you walk out of the restroom, there's a little thing where you can actually touch, was the restroom clean or unclean? It's so quick and so easy, and this is the way our reputation is actually becoming. It's such a digital age that we want to make sure that we address a lot of these, common issues, per se. And again, it all ties into reputation. So just a quick little note here. According to J.D. Power and Associates, in 2011, noise was the top complaint among hotel guests. And again, it's just one of those things that goes through, and a lot of times they use carpet on the floors, so these are carpets, we'll see how it actually absorbs a lot of sound. So back to sound control, the types of ratings, basically there's two types. There's going to be airborne sound, or we'll talk about this, there's airborne sound, which is called STC, and there's going to be impact sound, which is going to be sound, so airborne sound is what I'm doing right now while I'm talking, and then when I'm walking around, that's going to be the impact sound. With the rating systems, there's basically two different classifications, we'll call them. There's STC, which is sound transmission class. This is where we quantify airborne sound. And then impact sound is going to be IIC, which is the impact installation class. Again, what we're really talking about in this presentation is going to be floors. So most we're going to talk about is going to be the IIC rating. Now, the important thing to understand is that there's no correlation between the two. You can have a really, really good system that controls your impact sound, your substrate, but that doesn't affect the airborne sound quality. So again, there's no correlation between the two. So IIC, this is, has been integrated into the International Building Code, and there's actually a rating that they call out, and I'll explain what the numbers mean in a second. The IIC rating of 50, that's that number that they feel is a good quality of sound, for a guest below or above. And then where you see the AIIC, that's basically we're going to call it the field test. So there's going to be a laboratory test and there's going to be a field test, and I'll explain what the difference is there. But you can see how the rating's slightly different. Another thing I actually wanted to mention really quickly is just that this presentation, it's called a Quickfire, so I'm going through a lot of the information fairly quickly. You can also download the handouts for this presentation where it has all the slide notes. And at the end, I'll show you where you have my contact information, where you can actually contact me and we can discuss the information as well. So definitely, go online and download the handouts if you have questions. So basically with lab tests versus field tests. Laboratory test, just like we would think, a laboratory test is a very controlled environment, so they have a very consistent unit of measurement. When you get into the real world, things change. And that's why when you saw that 50 and the 45, those two different numbers, they know that we're in a laboratory, we're going to have a much more consistent number. When you get into the field, they accept the fact that the number is going to be a little lower probably. Again, they're both very accurate for field, very accurate for, and both of these have, may or may not be practical for the project, but they're definitely things that on the design side you're going to want to take a look at and determine whether you want to have the expense of a field test versus the most manufacturers have laboratory tests and field tests, but they can show you different ratings. So how do they do this test? It's on a lift and drop hammer system where they have 5 steel hammers in this machine that I'm showing you here, and it basically raises and lowers, hits the floor, and 10 times per second. And what it basically does is you have the floor that I'm on, we'll say, and then below here you would have a system of microphones that picks up the sound that transfers through the floor for the IIC class, and basically they calculate what that in turn means as far as an IIC rating. And depending on the type of components that are included in the assembly, it's going to change how that rating works, right? We're going to have a different number the more we add. So one of the big things is the IIC test is that it's a combination performance of all of the components, which is important. This is where we'll get into some of the myths and things with IIC and with sound. But also, the higher the number, the better the rating. So, 51 is better than 50. 49 is worse than 50. But it doesn't measure individual components. We'll talk about how that works in a second. So this is where we get into the delta. There's a delta IIC, and what the delta is this actually evaluates the flooring assembly. So not just an individual product, but the actual assembly. So an example would be, I can actually show you in here. It doesn't include the ceiling assembly. It basically measures 2 different things. It measures your substrate, which is going to be typically it's a bare concrete slab is what we're looking at, and a 6-inch bare concrete slab. In consistent testing, they show that it has its own contribution of 28 of an IIC. And then the test 2 that they do is going to be the concrete slab with everything above that concrete. And that's where they would get the, basically the delta contribution. So basically they take test 2 subtract test 1 out of it, and that's where they would get a number. So a better example of what this means, you have a bare concrete slab. We're going to say it's a 28 is the number that contributes. And then when we take our installation, we're going to have, you know, some type of a sound membrane in there. We're going to have thin set mortar, and in this case, tile on top of that. So this assembly of the floor is going to have a 48 when they test it. So we had a 28 when we had the bare concrete slab. Now we have a 48. So basically what they did is to get the delta IIC, they took the 48, subtracted the concrete, which is 28, equals 20. And just some things for reference. So vinyl, if we're going to have a vinyl floor, vinyl, you're going to have a delta contribution for that of a 7. If you're going to have hardwood is, you know, has less contribution, is going to have a 2. And then the interesting thing is if you have a direct bond tile assembly, it has a contribution of 0. And the reason, think about it, basically we've taken a 6-inch concrete slab, we've used thin set mortar, right? And we've bonded tile on top of it. So we basically took that concrete slab and went from 6 inches to 6.5 inches. So we just increased the thickness a little bit. So that's why it has 0 contribution. So some of the typical misconceptions or myths is that the IIC rating equals the delta IIC rating. The IIC is the whole assembly, and the delta is just the assembly above the concrete slab. And that's one of the things you definitely want to watch for. So the fact is that it's multiple components that contribute to the IIC value, and you want to use that delta to compare the performance of various underlayment materials. The other thing is that the delta IIC can be used for all flooring structures, and this is something that's very interesting, to me anyways, is that when you get into different types of assemblies or structures, concrete handles sound much differently than a wood substrate. So if you have a wooden joist system, when you put that product on top of it, it's going to handle sound differently. The IIC will be different. So, you know, really quickly on how the tile industry looked at this. So just a history of the tile industry with sound is way back in 2000. In 2000, we had 9 different details in the tile industry. In the TCA handbook back in the day. And of these 9 sound deadening details or sound control details, 9 of them were all fixed systems. So it was basically a concrete system with a mortar bed or a cement backer unit or something like that on top, and then tile on top of that. So it was a very thick system. There was only one detail in the 2000 handbook that had a thin system. And the interesting thing with the thin system, so this is basically just a thin set tile bonded, you know, bonding your tile. The interesting thing with it is in number 18 here, you can see it says sound rated ceiling assembly required. To achieve the numbers that they were trying to achieve, they required that substructure underneath the slab. So you had to have a drop ceiling with baffles and such things to get that number that they were going for. This being said, the Tile Council, you know, they basically looked at it and they said, wow, this just isn't really right to have all this information in there. Well, one of the reasons we had the information in there is we know that architects and designers use the handbook to, you know, to detail their tile assemblies. The side to this, though, is we all know that if anybody here is a tile contractor, that you're only responsible for what's above the floor, right? You don't have access underneath, and you're not doing drop ceilings usually if you're a tile contractor. So what the tile industry did is they removed that in 2001, and they added a white paper. And this, I want to just read this, it's important. It says, they added a note that says, using IIC and STC results to represent the sound deadening ability of an underlayment without describing in detail the whole flooring and ceiling assembly, it causes confusions at all levels. And that it ultimately misleads the consumer, because we're saying that, you know, we're showing you all of this, but we're really only giving you a very, very thin thing. So they replaced it with a white paper and really explained how sound works as far as IIC and STC. Now, the other thing that they did in the tile industry is they said, okay, we're dealing in tile assemblies. We got to make sure that we have something that works for a bonded assembly in a thin set application, because that's the way we set tile today in thin set applications. So they started working on this standard, and then they did come up with an ANSI standard in 2010 that it's ANSI A118.13. And it has two requirements, two very important requirements. One is that it has to have a contribution that actually is meaningful to the assembly, right? You can't have something, if it only has a contribution of 1 point, it's not really a sound, it's not really doing anything. So it has to have a minimum of a 10. And again, this is just a minimum. And then the other thing is that usually the way you get better sound control is with fluffy, right? The more squishy something is, the better it absorbs sound or traps sound. So with tile assemblies, the catch on that is that when you take tile and you put it on something that's soft, now you can have a tile failure, right? Because your grout joints will fail or your tile will crack because it's not properly supported, it's not load bearing. So the other part of the standard is not just that it has to perform, at a level for sound, but it also has to have something that will actually work for tile as well. So it has to have a minimum of a residential rating. Why do we say residential ratings? Because primarily when we're dealing in sound control, again, we're dealing with dormitories, we're dealing with hotels, and we're dealing with multifamily. These are all residential types of applications. And again, they're minimums. So different techniques, one of the things we put in here is we put sound rated ceilings. That's definitely part of the equation. We also want to make sure, that there's another part, you can do resilient sound underlayments or you can do bonded sound systems as well. We definitely feel that a multiple approach to get the number that you're actually looking for is something you're probably going to end up having to do. You're going to have some type of a membrane in the tile assembly, and then something potentially underneath that, depending on the number they're looking for, to get what you're actually going for. And you're going to want to look at both the pros and cons of both of these types of assemblies and determine which is the most effective technique for your application. So some of the other things, just common installation challenges, definitely, wherever we have perimeters around the floor, we want to make sure that we have something that prevents sound bridging to go through that assembly. So you have a perimeter, you have a soft joint around it, just like you would have a movement joint around your tile assembly, you're going to have something that's going to prevent that sound from traveling. As well as any type of penetrations or protrusions through the floor, we want to make sure that, like any type of plumbing, if you hard grout that tile assembly or hard packet to it, we want to make sure that sound can't transfer down or up. So you're going to have either some type of a batting or some type of a sealant system. The other part is if you are going to use a type of membrane that requires a cementitious backer unit to go on top of it, you want to make sure that the fasteners don't go through into the assembly. So if you're going over a wood assembly, kind of what we're showing here is these fasteners going through the cementitious backer unit, through the sound control membrane, and then into the substrate. What this is like a lightning rod that transfers directly into the assembly. So we've basically taken that sound product and we've eliminated its value. So just in wrap up here, sound control for tile underlayments, you want to make sure that if you're using a product, you want to make sure that it does meet at least an ANSI standard, and this is the ANSI standard for sound control, bonded sound control membranes. And also, some of the key takeaways that, thin bed tile assemblies, they can work very, very well for IIC, but it's not going to work for STC. STC is that sound that's going through the walls. It's a different type of assembly. The Delta contribution, as well as the IIC, that basically, we're talking about the flooring assembly. We want to make sure that you pay attention as well to the HOAs. So if there's a housing code for your region where you're working, that you're talking to them to find out what their minimums are. Sometimes these housing organizations aren't built up of architects, designers, and engineers. It's homeowners who basically might say that, well, we don't want to hear any sound, and you just want to be able to talk to them so they understand that they're going to have something going on there, so they have a realistic number. And again, we definitely want to make sure that you avoid a product that doesn't have a delta contribution. If you're talking about a product or to a manufacturer and you're going to use one of their materials, make sure that they have a delta contribution and that they can give you that actual number, not just a full assembly. Because sometimes this is where that smoke and mirrors occurs. Is they'll say, hey, we have a sound rating system. It's only this thick. It's but it gives you a 70 or some crazy number. Ask for that delta contribution of the product and the assembly. And again, it's more than just the tile assembly. It's more than just a tile installer in this application. We want to make sure to properly address it. We're involving early on in the specification, on the architectural and design side, that we're looking at this. You're asking the questions up front to find out what they're looking for, and then you're managing expectations is really the end goal. Again, My name is Earl Maicus. I'm with Schluter Systems. I really appreciate you attending. And if you have any questions or if you're viewing online, definitely send those questions in either through my email address. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it. Thanks.